Good afternoon. Welcome to Reflecting on the Dreams of the Chicago Freedom Movement and their pursuit for fair housing. This conversation is part of the What's Next series of roundtables hosted by the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota. I'm Megan Mell. I'm the Director of Alumni Experiences and Events for the College of Liberal Arts. I'd like to thank you all for joining us, whether you are watching live or viewing the recording. This afternoon's conversation is part of a series of roundtables addressing the important question of what's next for us to eliminate institutional and systemic racism in society. The series seeks to engage experts from the College of Liberal Arts, as well as throughout our community and beyond. And specifically in 2023 and 24, we are asking what's next for the dream. These discussions will explore where we are nationally and locally with regard to some of the demands put forward at the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his historic I Have a Dream speech. Our moderator for this afternoon is Dr. Brittany Lewis. Dr. Lewis is the founder and CEO of Research in Action, an urban research consulting firm, and is currently a senior research associate at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Lewis is the principal investigator of the report Illusion of Choice, Evictions and Profit in North Minneapolis, and the co-principal investigator on the report The Diversity of Gentrification, Multiple Forms of Gentrification in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Dr. Lewis's research has been used in a Minnesota Supreme Court to expand rights for tenants facing evictions, as direct testimony at the Minnesota State Legislature, and to inform the Human Services and Public Safety Impact Agenda within Hennepin County and the City of Minneapolis. Dr. Lewis, thank you for joining us. I invite you to begin today's conversation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really honored to be in space with you all, particularly with the panelists that we have here with you today. I also want to narrow in on the specifics of the topic that we are discussing within this series. So the 1960s Chicago Freedom Movement, one of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s most underanalyzed forms of racial protest, is a time worth re-examining. Chicago was one of the most residentially segregated cities in the country in the mid-1960s. Black homebuyers were effectively barred from predominantly white neighborhoods. Through organizing and protest, the Chicago Freedom Movement advocated for open housing, the right for Black homeowners to purchase anywhere they wish. Dr. King and his team would send large numbers of Black people into suburban real estate offices to test whether or not the real estate agent would make properties available for them to view. They aimed to uncover discriminatory practices which were confirmed time and time again. While we have made some progress since Chicago Freedom Movement and with the passage of the Fair Housing Act in '68, this panel really aims to reflect on what has changed since Martin Luther King Jr.'s Chicago Freedom Movement and consider perhaps what still needs to change. I think we often sit in a place and space of wanting to name what feels like progress and shy away from the material realities that many people in this country are still living within, and the ways in which different systems have reimagined the barriers and still, I think, produce harmed strategies and approaches. So I want us to have an honest conversation about that today. Before we dive into some of the topics that I'm hoping myself and my panelists can discuss together, I would love for you all to get a chance to meet some of these really amazing leaders that we have here today. I'm going to invite the leaders one by one to come on camera, share their name, their current leadership role or position, and one thing that they are proud that their work does or is doing to advance housing equity or civility work. And I'm going to invite Nelima to come in first and introduce herself.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. My name is Nelima Sitati Munene. I'm the Executive Director of ACER. ACER is the African Career Education and Resources, Inc. We're an issue-based organization, and our mission is to close the inequity gaps that exist within our communities. Part of our work that I'm really proud of that we're working on to advance housing in our community is our housing justice work, where we're organizing and tenants and building power within the tenant community to build leadership, and also to be able to advocate for better policies that can begin to close the inequity housing gaps that exist in our communities, and also just really address the root cause issues that have been, blanketed for so long, and not come up with band-aid solutions, but to really address the root cause of housing disparities and discrimination in our community.
Thank you so much, Nelima. I invite Eric to come on camera and introduce themselves.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. My name is Eric Hauge. I'm the Executive Director of Homeline. Homeline is a statewide tenant advocacy organization. Our main program is a free and confidential legal hotline that any renter in the state can contact and get specific individualized advice about their housing situation. And we're proud to have advised over 20,000 households last year and successfully advocated for significant changes to state law around the harmful impacts of evictions. Thank you.
If Commissioner Jennifer Ho could join us and introduce themselves.
I'm Jennifer Ho. I'm the Commissioner of Minnesota Housing. I've been in this job for a little over 5 years. And I think one of the things I'm really excited about is watching the team that I lead at Minnesota Housing, just over 300 people strong right now, really tackle the question of what is the role of state government in creating, perpetuating, and repairing the work around housing discrimination, whether that's in our work on homelessness or rental housing or home ownership. Like, we're the system. So, how do we go at this?
Thank you so much. And I invite Ben to join us and introduce themselves.
Thanks. So I'm Ben Horowitz. I work for the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, where I'm a senior policy analyst. Need to start with a stock disclaimer that the views I'm presenting here today are my own and not necessarily those of the bank or the Federal Reserve System. They do have everybody give that disclaimer. So yeah, I'm very honored to be a part of this conversation. I'm most proud of the way that our bank serves the district, which stretches from Montana over to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, for people who don't have the Federal Reserve districts in the front of their mind. I think we provide a lot of really high quality research on housing affordability challenges and solutions, with both really rigorous data, quantitative driven work, but also qualitative work that I think lifts up some best practices and innovative ideas from around our district and the nation.
Thank you, everyone. I'm super excited to dive in. And a lot of the questions I'm going to ask the panelists, really ask them to dive deep into where they see change happening, where they see barriers happening, and where they see possibilities. So the first question I want to ask, as I mentioned before in the description, I want to know how tactics like testing have been utilized to illustrate disparities in housing have been instructional to your work or the work of those you support or partner with. So how have tactics like testing been things that you all have used in your work or your partners have used to explore what is taking place? And what did you find there? What did you find there? And any person can unmute and lean in. I would love this just to be an exchange.
I'll just break ice and get it going for you, Dr. Lewis. I think that we see the value of testing, whether it's in presenting somebody as a renter, or home value appraisals, or home purchasing opportunities. What it really uncovers is the fact that discrimination isn't always blatant. That there's a lot of more subtle ways in which discrimination plays out. And I think that's really important for understanding that that discrimination, still happens today. It's not a relic of the past. And that because it's more I think the phrase is discrimination with a smile. That sometimes it's just, harder to prove, and testing is a great way to not only gather data about it, but also to identify, exactly where it's occurring.
And I'm curious from folks where they are seeing trends in what either tenants are sharing or homeowners are reporting that those subtle acts are taking place in the work.
Sure, I can jump in. Because we work with our tenants a lot, and I mean the issue of testing, I think I have also had a personal experience with it. I mean, I remember the first apartment that I rented was in a lily white suburb, and the only reason why I was able to rent at that time is because the apartment community had just recently, been sued and had come into a settlement because somebody had come in there and done some testing. Actually, it was involuntarily. It was really a mixed race, a racially mixed couple who had tried to rent an apartment, and the first time, the black, partner went, and I mean the white partner went, and they were told there's housing, and then when the partner went to say my wife will come and pay the deposit, when she went, she was told there was no housing. But anyway, and so when I lived there, I think we were only the second black family, to live in that apartment building, but it was very convenient and very close to my job. And so had that not happened, I would not have been able, to live in a place that is convenient for me and would enable me to make it to work and just be able, to do life, because where you live matters in how you're able to do your life. And in terms for us and how we do our work, we know that testing does work. And so we have been engaged in advocating for having more funding, for testing to be done. I know a few years ago, when we were looking at the data, at that time, I think they were not funding testing, and we could see the numbers, the numbers go up in terms of people not being able to have access to housing, and etc. And so that is part of the work that we do, is being able to use the data to continue to advocate for funding, for testing, to continue to happen for communities. From a very practical standpoint, as an organization that also works to increase access to housing for folks of color in our community, it's something that we just have to continue to be aware about, right? And so if a family is coming to me for housing, it's like, unfortunately, even in this day and age, I have to think strategically, right? Like, how am I going to help this family to really get into this housing? And, sometimes, the way I'll do it is like, I am going to have to think about who is the messenger I'm going to send in order to be able, if my goal is for success for this family, unfortunately, sometimes I know in the back of my mind who, the face that appears there is going to have to be, it's going to matter. And so using that to be able to make sure that the families that we're serving are going to be successful in accessing their housing.
I appreciate, Nelima, your willingness to even share your own personal story, because I feel like the politics of housing is very personal. A phrase I often use is this idea that choice is an illusion. It's really what choices are made available to you depending on your socioeconomic status, upbringing, employment. All these things define a lot of those things. When we were leaning heavily into the evictions project, I am never going to forget stories where, for a single mother with children struggling economically, was deciding between the choice of going to shelter or staying with the slumlord who would continue to show up unannounced, pursuing them for sexual favors for rent. And in that context, choice is an illusion. It's the choices that are made available to you in that context, and what choice, as you are moving in politics of survival for many of us, that I'm going to make next. And when we talk about subtle and or overt practices, and the example I just gave, there was a particular landlord that knew that someone was economically struggling and took advantage of that, or attempted to. So, I share that example because I think it matters that when we think about housing and this notion of housing choice, because that's a phrase thrown around quite a bit, that choice is actually an illusion for many low-wealth families. I think we need to disrupt this idea a little bit. Choice theory presumes that we all have the option to choose what place we desire to be at any given moment. And that's not entirely true. I don't know if others want to add to that question or things that they have seen or heard that are coming up for families as they are on that search. And I'll pause.
Yeah, I think going back to your original question about testing and that approach and the legacy of that approach, a few things came to mind for me. One is there's a few papers out there that build on that testing approach and try to get an even broader sense of what's going on in different markets. So this has been done in the occupation space, but also in the housing space, where researchers put together applications that are similar in every possible way except for an applicant's name or background. And then they look at the different response rates they might get from a prospective employer or a prospective landlord. And what they've found is that even in the wake of laws like ban the box laws or source of income discrimination laws, which are laws that basically try to prevent landlords from discriminating against people who rely on Section 8 vouchers to pay part of their rent. These studies find that you still see discrimination, and in some cases more discrimination against people where the person who's making the decision, because they can't rely on a criminal history or source of income, they basically rely on their racial prejudices about who's more likely to have a criminal history or receive a housing voucher. So I think that just underscores how important it is to continue to monitor how things are going for people, even when we do have strong laws in place to protect their rights and try to broaden choice, to your point about how choice is often limited or non-existent for a lot of people.
Thanks for that question, and I'll just jump off of what Commissioner Ho mentioned. I think it's exactly right that discrimination isn't always blatant. It's almost never blatant. When it is blatant, it is very blatant, and we sometimes hear about those. As I mentioned, we run a tenant hotline. Last year, we advised over 20,000 households about any number of topics. Fortunately or unfortunately, probably more unfortunately, we actually don't hear from clients very often about discrimination. It's very seldom asked about, and I think that's because most of the discrimination is not very blatant. Ben just mentioned source of income discrimination. Homeline, since the early 90s, did a study of that was similar to testing, where we had volunteers contact prospective landlords as contacting them as a tenant and asking about the availability of an apartment and if it could be rented using a Section 8 voucher. And for 15 years, we did a study from 1995 and for 15 years until 2010. And pretty consistently, we found that 2/3 of the rental units that we surveyed were off limits to tenants who intended to rent with a Section 8 voucher. That has not changed. The city of Minneapolis enacted a protection around this, and I'm going to forget the year, 2017 perhaps. And it took until last year because of landlords litigating the issue all the way to the Minnesota Supreme Court for the city to finally start enforcing that. So we hear about a lot of other less blatant ways that landlords use to discriminate against people. I will dispute what Ben said about that we have strong laws to protect people's rights, and that somehow stronger laws might actually cause more discrimination. Landlords write the leases, landlord attorneys write the leases. The reason we have a whole chapter of tenant landlord law is because they get to pick the rules for the most part. And so I'll leave it at that. I'll just say, one other comment I'll just add is that before I was director at Homeline, I was a tenant organizer, and I sat in a tenant meeting that the tenants organized at a property in Richfield, where a new owner was just basically displacing thousands of people in an attempt to upscale the apartment complex. And the tenants were lucky enough to have asked a representative from the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at HUD, out of the Chicago office, to come and speak to them at that meeting. And that representative from HUD talked about the Fair Housing Act being a box, and that there's only so much that they could do within the context of the experiences that those low-income renters were facing, and what the Fair Housing Act, what that office could accomplish with the Fair Housing Act. And I think that's there are definitely some things that certain types of discrimination that can be combated using the Fair Housing Act, but we are vastly behind on protecting renters from a variety of very harmful management practices that are effectively use a variety of things as a proxy for race.
I just wanted to chime in really quick, if I could, that we got one step closer to banning source of income discrimination this weekend. Representative Mike Howard has included language that would, clarify what's been in the Minnesota Human Rights Act for ages, that you can't do this. And so one step closer up at the Capitol, and that's a good opportunity for me also to thank Eric, Nelima, and all the other advocates up at the Capitol that are helping us make a push on this.
I'm kind of curious along this vein. I think like policy is, in some sense, it is language that we create that gets trickled down to department leaders or supervisors or others to enforce. And I'm kind of curious what you all have seen as the challenges within, whether it's from the Fair Housing Act to other policies and practices that are designed to support or protect home buyers or renters or other folks, and what has been the challenges of enforcement that you all have seen, and what are the debates that you all might be engaged in yourself in that place, and what are the challenges of that?
So, I mean, for us, most often, what we hear from, I'm speaking from the community side, I think a lot of time is resources, right? I mean, a lot of times we talk about, as organizers, talk about responsibility without resources. So if you enact something and it requires more resources, in terms, like I in my earlier comments, I talked about, advocating for more resources for testing to be done, because, it costs money, for some of these policies to be enacted. And so if most of the time, if a policy is enacted and there are no resources allocated to it, then most of the time the agency might just not be able to to enact the policy itself. Sometimes also we think about, I mean, just from my experience from a community perspective and organizing perspective, sometimes we see a difference in whatever administration is in place. And so it makes me think about the political will. Sometimes it depends on who's in office at any given moment and what their priorities are, and what the political will is to enforce the laws that are already on the books.
I fully agree with what Nelima just said. I think, again, what I mentioned before, a challenge is that, what Nelima just said about political will. We have been advocating for stronger tenant protections for decades, and when there is some progress made, it's usually not to the extent that it addresses the actual experiences of our clients in a way that is useful for them. And then that is then taken up as, well, the policy doesn't work. Unfortunately, there's a lot of there's compromises made because of the lack of political will in some of these protections. And I mean, that's true, for example, in Minneapolis in, I think, 2019 passed some regulations around tenant screening to try to protect the rights of tenant, or allow more housing access for renters who had evictions on the record or had criminal backgrounds. And there were significant compromises made in the way that the city ordinance was prepared, effectively due to landlords whose their process is to simply litigate any sort of progress made in this space. And as a result, then we get policies that are not quite as strong as they should be to actually address the experiences that renters face. You know, and that's true of the source of income effort in Minneapolis as well. And so, and thanks, Commissioner Ho, for mentioning that, you know, there is an effort at the state level. I am going to hopefully share in the chat that there are some ways that attendees can support that effort, because it still is a possibility at the state level.
You know, the question, Dr. Lewis, hits a little close to home because I've worked in the HUD headquarters and, you know, just in this role. Yeah, I think one of the, in your invitation to be a part of this conversation and the use of the phrase open housing, and, you know, the pivot that was quickly made, I think, from the phrase open housing to the term fair housing, I think there's a lot to unpack in that. And because we know it's not a level playing field. We know it's not like upholding fairness. It's really about trying to find a way to repair past harm. And yeah, I think just even the conversation, around affirmatively furthering fair housing, one of the hardest phrases to say 3 times fast. And all that, it's just, it's been such a struggle. But I experience this a lot in the conversations that I get to have with the tribes and the tribal leaders, where they view the tribal distinction as being one of sovereignty and governance and nation, not a distinction of race, and yet there's always hanging out there whether a practice of a tribal preference off reservation land, for example, would be pursued by HUD as a violation of fair housing. And, you think about like tribes trying to help their members get decent, affordable housing in the communities of their choice, not just on reservation land. And the fact that that potentially could be the subject of a HUD fair housing complaint, I mean, that's just like, that's messed up. And, I think that, so I think that this examination, so I really did enjoy your pushing me to go do my homework and understand the origin of the term open housing as opposed to the term fair housing. And I appreciate your comment about choice. I mean, our vision statement is that all Minnesotans live and thrive in a stable, safe, and accessible home they can afford in a community of their choice. But I think it's important that it be in that statement, because I think that we have to appreciate that we have to make more options happen. We have to make choice real, and that that is, an important part of what we do. That it's not just kind of a ribbon, a ribbon or a bow on the phrase, but that there's kind of a mandate embedded in that.
Yeah. I really appreciate you kind of transitioning us a bit, because I do want to talk with everyone about this idea of like how open housing, which originally being the right for Black homeowners to purchase wherever they wish, have influenced debates in housing just broadly speaking, and how it's transformed to this different language from open housing to fair housing, and how some of those debates have caused maybe more harm than good. I feel like a concrete example that I think of right here in the Twin Cities is what took place after the series of lawsuits connected to whether it's like Chicago versus Control or other lawsuits that, you know, demolish public housing all across the country for the purpose of like everyone being able to move where they desire. And it's created this really interesting debate in housing amongst, you know, many scholars and activists around the politics of choice and also the politics of proximity. Where it seems like the courts used like the framework for Black and brown folks asking for more choice as a fuel to then like make Black and brown folks being in close proximity to one another like a part of the issue. And I think it's kind of become a part of how we talk about this debate in a problematic way, in my opinion. But I'm really curious for other folks, whether it's in your work on the ground or how you're engaging with other researchers or policymakers, how is this debate, what does it sound like when you're doing your work? How is it either causing more harm or more confusion? And or do you feel like there's any movement in the debate that's going in a positive direction in your work?
So I will jump in first. So a big part of the challenge with the debate, like it's hard to have this just have a conversation or just have something written on paper, because it's hard to incorporate all the complexities and all the multiple layers that are at play, in the situation about, open housing, right? So for example, for me here in Minnesota, I think about, the Holman's decree and the demolitions of the projects, in North Minneapolis and the subsequent rebuilding of Heritage Park, and, the displacement that happened and so on and so forth. And then another situation that we have been heavily engaged in is this, I don't know if it's a complaint, lawsuit, whatever, that keeps popping up and given times, complaints against the cities of, started out as complaints against the city of Minneapolis, Brooklyn Park, Brooklyn Center. I believe Richfield was part of the complaint about, I live in, Brooklyn Park is my community, and, alleging that we have, an overabundance of affordable housing. I think the idea of open housing, yes, people should be able to live, in a place of their choice. But I think you said earlier, choice is an illusion. In our work, we talk about false choices, right? So for us, what we think about, I am part of a table called Equity in Place in time, because I think sometimes what this idea fails to do is to really say, how do we make things more equitable in every place, right? Yes, people should be able to live wherever they choose, but are the circumstances equal? If we think about, would this individual or would this family make the same choice to move to a different place if everything, that is in that place, should was available in the community, where they live? It's not a zero-sum game. It's not an either or, it's a both. And I think part of my frustration with the conversation has been the way it is framed. Yes, we should expand housing everywhere, so that everybody can be able to live wherever they choose to live. But in the same breath and with the same vigor, we should also advocate for, whether it's redevelopment without displacement, all the amenities that exist in these so-called areas of prosperity to exist. So first of all, the fact that we just admit that the areas of, that the areas of concentrated poverty, as if it's happenstance and it just happened, it's problematic to me, right? As if we disperse the poverty or we dilute the poverty, then that is going to be great. I think we should ask both questions. And I know change takes time. So at the same time, I'm not advocating for people to just only stay in place. It takes a long time to build housing. And so, yes, people should be able to move to a better place for now, but the conversation should not end there. And it should not be only a one-sided conversation. It's not an either or, it is a both. And the last thing I will say about that from a cultural perspective is we have to look at the whole holistic, picture. For a lot of communities of color, and especially the immigrant community, social capital is important. And so when we're not looking at the effects of what happens when we disperse communities and people lose connections to their culture and so on and so forth, then that is also detrimental. I would just like to have a more holistic view, of the conversation, and address all those things, simultaneously.
I was gonna see if one of the guys wanted to jump in. Go ahead, Ben. I feel like I was just talking.
Oh yeah, I think Nelima laid out the duality or the conflict that can be there sometimes when we're talking about ideas like open housing, which is people tend to go right to how do we help people move more places without thinking about how we help people stay in their community of choice as well. So we work a lot on housing supply because we see a lot of data that do show places that do a better job allowing for a more robust supply of housing do see slower rent growth and more affordability. And there's some newer research out there that shows that even when higher cost market rate housing comes online, the chain of moves that inspires can free up lower cost housing for other people. But I think the danger in any approach to a problem is when you get a hammer and everything becomes a nail and you start thinking, supply is the only problem. I think in the wake of the fair housing legislation, and to clarify something earlier too, I didn't mean to imply earlier that we have sufficient renter protections. That's not really something I'm in the place to gauge. But I think we tend to make legislative achievements and then assume that everything's going to kind of carry forward. And we don't think about the fact that things like exclusionary zoning can pop up after you get rid of credit barriers to people living in certain areas or reduce discrimination in other ways. So that's why we tend to focus on housing supply, but I do think it's really important to have big tables when you're talking about the future of communities to ensure that everybody has a voice in how their communities are going to develop and try to address both sets of concerns as much as possible.
Nelima, I really appreciate how you provided a very kind of nuanced framework for us to lean into. I love the question of how do we make a place equitable within every choice that's made available? And you're talking more about the nuance of what's available in that place and how we're almost measuring what is whether it's the resources, the experience, the connections, social capital, etc. How are we evaluating those things as equally as important as the idea of choice? And I guess I'm curious for folks, have we seen good models of this? What does that look like? What does it look like, right?
I don't know if this answers your question, but one of the things I just wanted to point to is across the state, we're about ready to unlock $150 million of down payment assistance for first-generation homebuyers. And that's over and above the kind of level of down payment assistance that we at Minnesota Housing and our lending network does today. I think it's an interesting point. Ben, you were talking about credit. We know there's wealth gap and all these other things, but what happens if we intentionally create tools that help try to overcome some of that? So I'm really excited that in the coming weeks, both the Community First Generation Down Payment Assistance Program, I'll say coming weeks vaguely because I don't think we all have dates set, but in the coming weeks, the Community First Gen and the Agency First Generation Down Payment Assistance Programs, this is, $35,000 of additional help. And I think that one has the potential to expand choice in terms of communities where you can afford to live. But also, of course, I think it just deals with that wealth and asset gap and just says, you have enough income to pay the mortgage, but you don't have enough cash in the bank to be able to get in the door. And, First Gen is obviously kind of a proxy for dealing with the racial disparities in housing. But, it might turn out that it's not a bad proxy. I'm really curious to find out if it's a pretty good proxy. And then, of course, the work that we're supporting that others are doing with special purpose credit programs, real intentional, opportunities to target special products that really try to address closing the homeownership gap and supporting choice, or more choice, perhaps, is the way to put it out there. So this is something I'm excited about, and I just wanted to say that. Also, Nelima, when you mentioned equity in place, I just have a lot of gratitude for equity in place. Alyssa Wetzel-Moore, who's my community development director, who's out there in the audience, the virtual audience, one of the first places she brought me was to the Rondo Library in an in-person meeting on a snowy day, my first couple months as commissioner, to sit with equity in place. And that's really the beginning of that conversation, dialogue that, we've had good days and bad days in that conversation over the course of, 5 years and change, but it's an important conversation, and I think what I said that first time we met that, I hope folks know still pertains today is that I want the organizations around that table to know that they have access to the commissioners conference room. They have access, to me and my team in this conversation, because it's important that we listen to a whole range of voices and perspectives on these issues. And, I think that equity in place has been a real powerful center for some of these conversations. So just want to tip my hat to Nelima and everybody who's been really active in that and persistent in helping us build the conversations that we need to have between community-based organizations and state government.
I think an example that comes to mind, we did a recent case study on Bloomington's inclusionary zoning policy. So inclusionary zoning, broadly speaking, it basically says, if you're, in some cases it says, if you're going to build multifamily housing in our jurisdiction, then here's some affordability requirements you have to meet with that. And they get really bespoke from there on out in terms of the trade-offs that cities might present to developers. And the reason that we decided to highlight this approach above others was that Bloomington did get a lot of credit from a lot of different stakeholders for bringing in a lot of feedback on how their approach would actually play out in real life. Because with a policy like that, you can see how if you don't have diverse groups contributing to the conversation, then on the one hand, you might make a policy so severely restrictive on the economic front that developers can no longer actually build in your community. And on the other front, if you're not addressing other concerns from the community, then you might not be achieving everything that you're setting out to do by trying to put that priority into ordinance as opposed to just not having it, I guess. So I think that's one really specific kind of local example that came to mind when you asked the question.
Ben, I actually appreciate you bringing up this example because I'm sure this shows up in all of our work. And I share this when I'm in community. For instance, when I talk about the politics of gentrification, I say gentrification is a market process that was always going to happen. So I describe what that means. So when I share that because we're understanding that we're balancing multiple interests that are actually predicated on one another. And sometimes aren't in alignment, if we're going to be honest. whether it's connected to what their actual interests are, whether it's economic or cultural or otherwise. But in many ways, we need all these actors, right, to both, but it's build community, create community, and sustain community. And so I feel like in Ben's example, like it's illustrating the value of building intentional tables, but then the hard work of what the table has to actually wrestle with. And I'm pretty sure all of us have been at some of those hard tables. And I'm curious, as we've sat at those tables, how have we navigated them? When have we been able to find like a strategic consensus? Doesn't mean we're going to agree on everything, because we got to just admit that. But then when are we walking away feeling like maybe this strategic moment wasn't for that other goal? And do we walk into spaces even with that mindset? I'm curious from you all, just as leaders, as you're walking into those rooms, knowing that we are mediating multiple interests, and that all those interests are coming to kind of a head when we're trying to build community. What comes up for you all when I share that? Or what's hard about that?
I think I started by saying, yeah, the conversation is complex because there's the desire and the goal to create, and then there's the real world and the multiple players and different interests and, you know, and so on and so forth. For example, in Brooklyn Park, we passed a local ordinance a number of years ago, and we just called it a mixed income policy that required, you know, and there was a lot of compromise, you know, to get the ordinance done, again, reflecting all the different interests and, you know, so on and so forth, and, you know, what could actually, you know, get built, what really pencils out, and etc. And so, I mean, you know, we really wanted to name where the greatest need of housing we were seeing was, which was at the 30%, you know, area median income. And so, but then also had to compromise about realistically, like what will that percentage look like, or what the number of you know, of units be, and also it was tied to if the developer was seeking any type of, you know, any type of public concession, you know, and so we saw it as a starting point. Yeah, we saw it as a starting point, and that point, it was important for us to have an ordinance in the book that we could perhaps come back and revisit and make stronger if we needed to, or etc. But it was important for us to have an ordinance in the book, and so that was the compromise level that we came up with. We really wanted to see, you know, the 30% AMI, because that is where the greatest need is.
Dr. Lewis, I was actually hearkening back to the first day I met you, also in the first couple months that I was in this role over at the Walker with the African American Leadership Forum for the Trust Black Women and Girls event that you invited quite a few of us newbie commissioners to, and sitting and listening to, I think you maybe used the word testifiers that day, and I think, you know, what really has stayed with me, you know, from those conversations is it's the facts of people's experience over a lifetime and generations that that establish their current mindset about who they should or shouldn't be able to trust, and factors around making a big decision like buying a home. And I just always remember, you know, a woman just saying, you know, when, you know, when I grew up in a family where we owned it and it could be taken away from us, you know, why would I believe that I go into this 30-year deal and it's not going to be done to us again? And you know, just, you know, I just have held that day. And I think that's part of the conversation, like for example, around like light rail or the Botno line. You know, I think there's you put 10 people in a room and ask for their opinions as to whether the green line and the blue line create gentrification or help preserve and build economic opportunities, you know, through some of these neighborhoods. I think you're going to get 10 different perspectives on what happened there, and certainly a part of the conversation that that we're involved with our friends over at the Met Council around the Botno line and the real, you know, concerns that community members have about, you know, is this designed to actually break up our community, or is this designed to help our community? And I think for me, you know, the especially given the positional authority that I have in my role, you know, really, you know, approaching those conversations with a great deal of humility around the fact that, you know, communities have been, you know, devastated before. And so there's no reason not to walk into a conversation with the expectation that, you know, things that are set up as being community good, you know, might actually have a devastating effect, you know, whether by design or through ignorance. And so I think that's, yeah, I guess a gratitude to you, Dr. Lewis, for giving me, you know, a concrete reference point in my tenure in this job to be able to think about that stuff. But I think it's just really important. And I think that, yeah, I think that's why it's so important, the work that we're doing at Minnesota Housing, to really, really, really challenge ourselves around who's around our tables, whose tables are we around, who are we listening to, who has outsized influence, who has historic influence, who needs to have more opportunities to have influence. And, you know, I think that's part of the journey that we're on at the agency.
Yeah, I think I can talk about this question a bit in the context of how we decide to do the work that we do, because like any organization, we have limited people, limited resources for data and things like this. So how do we prioritize the questions we try to answer and how we try to answer those questions? These are, there's no like right way to answer those questions. So what work are we doing to make sure that we're doing the best we can to ask questions that are relevant within our district? And then what work are we doing to make sure that when we release our work, we understand the context that it's going into, we understand who might see our work if we don't lift a finger beyond putting on our website, and who might really benefit from knowing about our work if we have a conversation about how to share information with them. So as one example, we have access to a privileged set of mortgage application data. And for the first time, that data was going to include credit scores, which was one go-to reason people use to explain racial disparities in mortgage approval rates. So we thought it was worth it to incorporate that credit score into some statistical analysis to see, like, does the credit score actually, we know there's racial differences in credit scores. Do those racial differences kind of explain why there might be mortgage approval disparities? We found that it didn't explain it, both at a national level and here in the Twin Cities. And so we didn't just kind of send that out into the world. We also are in constant conversation with folks who work in the mortgage industry and people who serve applicants for mortgages to make sure that there aren't further questions we can ask with the data we have to explain our work, what it says and what it doesn't say. And yeah, wherever possible, when people ask us to present on our work, we also try to leverage that to say, well, like, tell us what you think about it, and like, what are you seeing in the field that we can't see in our numbers or from up in our tower on Hennepin. So
I appreciate everyone leaning into some of these questions, particularly about leadership and like how we maybe hold ourselves accountable to how we show up, and what we keep in mind when we go into these nuanced spaces. The last question I want to ask folks before we open it up for question and answers from the audience, based on what you're seeing in your work, who do you feel like is most negatively impacted by housing instability today? And what factors are contributing to that reality? Who do you feel like is most negatively impacted today? And what factors are contributing to that reality? What comes up for folks?
I can speak up. I would say, last year, one of the projects we have is that we send a multilingual letter to every defendant in an eviction case in the state. And last year we sent over 25,000 letters. Dr. Lewis, you did some instrumental research in this area around North Minneapolis, and I think that this is just one of the housing instability. I mean, that's just clear housing instability is a formal eviction action. And there is obviously some data that can be analyzed on that because it goes through a court process, but there is a lot of data missing there in terms of who is directly impacted. There has been research on that, and it's clear, and based on our client volume, we advise a disproportionate number of members of the BIPOC community, particularly around evictions and other forms of housing instability. The other aspect of this that is really lacking in research is the informal eviction process, and that's been talked about a little bit. Nelima and Equity in Place have really focused on the issue of displacement, informal displacement actions that happen as a result of redevelopment or other things. But we advise many tenants about informal displacement actions that happen outside extrajudicial evictions effectively. And there have been some efforts to address that. In some cities, Brooklyn Center enacted a just cause protection after the work of ACER and organizers and renters in that community, and there's efforts to do that on a state level. But there is also, I think, a stereotype that we hear about a lot of renters being very mobile. And in addition to those like direct landlord actions, landlord initiated displacement actions like evictions or informal notices to vacate, repair issues have been historically the top issue that we advise about. And that is, we hear from our clients that they're often told, well, if you don't like it, just move. And the housing stock that I don't like to call it naturally occurring affordable housing. I mean, that a cave is a natural occurring home. I don't think housing that's built and then is left to disintegrate because there's not adequate investment by the landlord when the renters are paying their rent to improve the place. That's not a natural process whatsoever. But where was I going with that? That is an aspect of every client we talk to about repair issues. They are fearful about retaliation. There's a lot of rights that people have on a local and state level to address the conditions of their housing, which in some cases forces them to move. But it is it's a very intimidating experience. People are they just don't trust that invoking and enforcing their rights is going to result in maintaining housing stability and improving their housing. And there's plenty of examples where it doesn't. And so I keep bringing up examples of how things are terrible, but there are efforts to improve protections for renters in these situations, because that's what we need to look to is that our clients know how their housing can be improved and how to stabilize their housing, and they're often not listened to in the public policy sphere. And I think efforts by Equity in Place and others to get the word out about the experiences that low-income renters face, formal processes like evictions, 25,000 last year, informal evictions that there is really no method of measuring, and then the circumstances where people are effectively forced to move because of unsafe, unhealthy housing experiences.
So I'll jump in and just piggyback on some of what Eric said, because this question really resonated with me. And I'll start with low wealth tenants of color, because they're highly impacted by this issue. We know that most of them are spending easily over 50% of their income on rent alone. And so they cannot afford to incur any other emergency. And what are the factors contributing? I mean, to be honest, I feel like even the way we have this conversation about housing, it's on a very special level, areas of concentrated poverty and etc. And to some extent, it's like sometimes I feel like we have just decided, well, there's just a certain group of people who are going to continue having these problems, right? I also dislike greatly the term natural occurring affordable housing. So thank you so much for pointing that out. Let's just stop using using that term. I think some of the things also that we don't look at when it comes to tenants, Eric is spot on when he says the narrative around tenants is like, oh, they're highly mobile. Nobody wants to move like twice a year and etc., right? But nobody's asking the question. And then also when we term this housing to be like a natural occurring affordable housing, nobody is looking at the hidden costs that the tenants are incurring. It's so expensive, frequently moving, unhealthy housing, and the medical bills that they incur, the high bills that they incur because, there are drafts and etc. The refrigerator is broken, landlord is not fixing, I have to throw away $300 worth of groceries, and so on and so forth. We are not telling the real stories about, what is really happening, in this apartment units. And I am glad, Commissioner Hall has talked about, the down payment assistance, which is critical because we have a lot of tenants who are paying rent that is more than mortgage, right? And so there's not enough effective pathways to home ownership, and those are some of the things that we would like to see so that folks can be stable, not only be stabilized, but they can also start building wealth. The other category of people that I think about and we do not talk a lot about is our youth. And in the area where I live and work, I feel like it is becoming, a bigger issue. Our young community, especially youth of color, and the LGBTQ community are really facing a lot of hidden homelessness. So for youth, for young people, it's not very obvious, when they're couch hopping, etc., and just hanging out with their friends and then sleeping in their cars and nobody really knows, where they're going at night. And then with the restrictions in shelters about age, if you don't have an ID, you can live in a shelter. So it is a huge problem, and we're not talking enough about it. Student housing, college students, and then we all know that during the summer, even at the University of Minnesota, students have to evacuate from their housing, and where do they go? We're not really having that conversation, and that is of great concern to me. And what are some of the influences? I think we have to talk about school systems, right? And the negative impact they have on housing. So a lot of times when we're talking to young people, if their parents lose housing, they don't want, especially if they're in high school, they don't want to change schools. And so the idea that you have, our school system is designed where you have to draw only from the, area that, that you live in, you can only go to this, to this local school. That's problematic because high schoolers are not going to move if mom moves, So they're going to couch hop so they can graduate from the high school, that they have been going to, because they're not going to go and start all over again. I think in terms of school systems, we have faced a lot of adversity from, some school districts from building affordable housing in some areas because schools are funded through property taxes, right? And so we have to talk about more about how our school systems can, and how they are funded and how they're run can have an adverse effect, on housing and on homelessness. And the last category of people, and I don't have data on this, but it's just based on our work and more what we have been encountering in our work is Black women, and especially older Black women, right? A lot of folks are coming to us and really at a precarious stage, and it's something that I personally would really like to dig into more. Is a lot of, and these are a lot of them are women. Some of them I know, I've watched them go through their career, and etc. Have been very active members of the community, but when they retire and they are on a fixed income and the cost of housing has been going up, they are our elderly Black women, and a lot of them are hiding it. We know that in the Black communities, we have, I think it's like a 51% are headed by female household, a lot of times single. And one of the things I can attribute to this is, Black women are still making 65% to every dollar that, that white men make. 65 cents, right? And so I think it's just, we're low income earners all through our working life. And so how are we going to build wealth? How are they going to build wealth to secure themselves when they retire? And again, it is also, which I don't know how about other folks, but for us in our work, we're just seeing a disproportionate amount of elderly Black women, and a lot of them are not just living on their own, they're taking care of a grandchild or supporting a disabled child who is also an adult. But I'll stop there. But those are the three category of folks I thought about.
It's hard to follow you, but I'll do it in just the interest of chiming in on one more thing. I've been working on ending homelessness for almost 25 years now. And if you're Native American, you're 28 times more likely to experience homelessness than if you're white. If you're Black, you're 13 times more likely to experience homelessness than if you're white. And, if you go to a homeless shelter, you can see that. If you go to an encampment, you can see that. And so I think what I'd say is the folks who are most negatively impacted by housing instability today are people who don't have a home, and people who haven't had a home of their own for quite some time. You kind of asked something about the systemic things that contribute to it. Everything. A history of slavery and genocide, and then everything. And I think it's just it is another one of those kind of the myth of Minnesota exceptionalism, because every statistic where we wave the we're the best, we're the best. If you dig into the racial disparities, we're definitely not the best, and so I really think that the systemic factors are so sweeping. I always thought in my early work on homelessness, I kind of came to an understanding that homelessness is a result of everything else being broken. And so the systemic solutions, are ultimately going to have to be about, getting at all of it. And the good news is that on an individual level, we can break the cycle of homelessness by, offering a dignified place that people want to live and the support that they need to live there. But to stop the inflow, is just going to take an awful lot of systemic work across the spectrum, from criminal justice to education to healthcare to the cost of housing to, on and on and on.
Thank you, everyone that shared thus far. Ben, I don't know if you want to leave us with some of your thoughts.
Oh, I don't. Yeah, going last. That's a big burden. Yeah, I thank you for sharing this question with us in advance. I took it really literally, and I really struggled to, like, with the most part of it. I think everybody's done a really great job explaining their perspective, and I think the only thing I can really add maybe is that one thing in common might be folks who basically don't fit into the systems that have been set up to take people into housing are the ones who will struggle to find housing, especially when we have not produced or invested in the existing stock enough to have enough affordable, accessible, quality homes for everyone. So if you don't have a credit score, or you don't have a consistent job history, or you're not a W-2 employee, these are all things that put you at a disadvantage because of the competition we've created through scarcity that doesn't really need to exist if we think about creating an environment where housing is abundant for all. So yeah, thanks again for the invite and the opportunity to contribute here.
Yeah, thank you all. This was an amazing conversation. I guess I often wish conversations about the politics of housing, choice in housing, and our solutions to what is a systemic issue could be had with such grace and kind of leadership. And I know that's not always what's happening when we're at some of these tables. So I appreciate everyone coming to space, being honest about, I think, their opinions and perspectives, and willing to kind of engage with one another as we think about the roles we play individually in supporting these debates and the work moving forward. I want to make sure we can answer a few questions from the audience, maybe 2 or 3 before our time is up. So I'll pass over to Megan to help us with that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Lewis, and thank you to our panelists for this really engaging discussion. I'm just really quickly going to post a resource in the chat that Eric shared. It's a way for people to support the proposed state legislation around source of income discrimination protections. So I will go ahead and share that in the chat, and then we'll go ahead and answer as many questions as we can before we hit 1 o'clock. So one of our questions that came through is, and I'm going to put this out to the entire group, so whoever would like to answer this, please jump in. Could affirmatively furthering fair housing, AFFH, help end homelessness or be a benefit to helping unhoused people? And I will also add, if you could share more about what AFFH is for those who may not know, that would be helpful.
I'll give you this hasn't been an area that I worked closely on, but I've worked adjacent to people who worked hard on this, especially during the period that I served at HUD. It's reading meaning into words in the Fair Housing Act around what does it mean to actually, affirmatively try to make housing more fair. And, I think it's one of these things that I think it took HUD 40 years to actually rulemaker around this. And because there were lots of just starts and stops, and it's something that kind of gets caught up in the politics. So we published a rule at the end of the second Obama term. It got pulled back in the following administration. It's back out again, new and improved. But I think the whole goal is to really get communities to use their data to understand the nature of the problem and to seek active solutions that help build greater equity in the housing space. So as it relates to the question on homelessness, I think that it's incumbent on communities to not just view homelessness as a transient issue, and therefore folks, I appreciate that folks experiencing housing instability and homelessness are actually citizens of place. And that as we look at data around things, that we kind of not finger point around people who are experiencing homelessness as kind of not a part of our communities, but really understand how the strategies that we're putting in place to make the housing world work better for people of color, that it includes an examination of what's going on around the experience of homelessness. I think that's the best piece I have of trying to connect a really complex regulatory frame to a really specific question.
Thank you. Our next question is a little longer. The money that will soon be available for first-gen and first-time buyers is very exciting, given the lack of available housing for ownership, especially in the first-time homebuyer range. Is there a concern that this money will not be able to be used? The competition is fierce in the $300,000 or lower price range. These homes often get many offers. Sellers tend to choose the easiest offer. New starter homes are desperately needed to meet the demand. What can be done from a policy perspective? What is being done?
I feel like I should jump in on this again. I don't want to be an answer hog. But the thing that's been remarkable to me is, despite rising interest rates, despite home prices, despite a pandemic, at Minnesota Housing, we've done over $1 billion of homebuyer mortgages, pretty consistently, maybe plus or minus a little bit. And so, despite all the incredible headwinds, people are still trying to become first-time homebuyers and are successfully doing that. And I feel like it's kind of defied gravity in many respects. So yeah, absolutely, we have to be doing more around production, and we need to be doing more to just create more options. I think that there was a lot of discussion at the Capitol. I don't know that it had time to fully take shape, but conversation around out-of-state corporate investors taking over previously owner-occupied homes. I mean, there's a lot of headwinds, but I think what I hear is that despite that, people are finding a way, and with tools like an extra $30,000 boost, that might just be what people need. I mean, we'll be watching that really, really carefully. I would be surprised if the $50 million that the agency has to put towards this, I would be really surprised if it doesn't fly out the door. But we look forward to to taking a look at that and understanding it, and 150 million in total. So it's everything that statistically you look at would suggest that home ownership, especially for low to moderate prospective home buyers, would have ground to a halt, and it hasn't. And I'm not the researcher that Ben is or anything like that, but like I said, best I got is phrases like "it defies gravity." But it also, I guess, makes me optimistic that $150 million is going to help folks who are really worrying that home ownership isn't going to be possible for them. That despite the fact that they've taken a first-time homebuyer class, and despite the fact that they've qualified, can they make it happen? And this might just be the difference between it not happening and it happening. And so I'm actually optimistic, and we'll be happy to report out kind of how many months did it take for us to move $50 million into the world. I'm counting in months, not years.
We have a two-part question here. Are some of the opportunities for first-time buyers include not only being able to afford the mortgage, but to afford monthly expenses like insurance and utilities? And are solar energy subsidies part of the affordable plans in place?
Sorry, panelists, I think these are all falling in my sweet spot. I think one of the things that's really important is that we set up first time and certainly first generation home buyers, that we set folks up for success. So we don't want folks to take on a mortgage that their monthly income can't afford. And I think to do that is just to do a disservice. And I mean, talk about things that can really hurt your credit record and all that stuff. We just don't want to set people up to not be successful. So I think it's important that folks be able to buy down the mortgage so that the monthly payment will match what it is that they can confidently expect to be making. And yeah, this is a long-term relationship. You and your mortgage. So, I mean, I think it's, really important to do that in a clear-eyed way. So the answer to the first question is if folks can't afford the overall expenses of the home, then the home price is too high, or they need more down payment assistance to buy down the monthly payment. The second piece is we're really excited about all of the federal money. It's so many acronyms that I've lost track, but the Inflation Reduction Act and greenhouse gas emissions, and I mean, all that stuff, we're going to see more federal money, solar for all. There's lots of opportunities here, and we're partnering with Commerce and the Pollution Control Agency and others to really try to seize these opportunities and figure out how to make them work in the residential space for both homeowners and in the rental market. So I'm optimistic. It's not imagined as a part of down payment assistance, but I think there's a secondary opportunity around climate and energy.
I can chime in and say we have looked at data that are currently available on homeowner costs. I should say mortgage holder cost, which is kind of the way the data are cut. So people who have a mortgage, we did not see a huge increase in their non-mortgage costs through 2022. And that's an article that'll come out hopefully sometime in the next few months. There was some variation across cities, but what that obviously doesn't tell us is anything after 2022. And I think we're hearing a lot about insurance rates in particular, both for homeowners, but also for operators of multifamily housing. So whether it's an affordable, like subsidized provider, whether it's someone who's operating market rate housing that is affordable to lower income households, or whether it's people operating, newer market rate and above buildings, we just heard that insurance is a real struggle and something that's gone up in cost a lot as the quality of what you get for that cost has gone down. So that's just still in the stage of, those are anecdotes we're hearing, and something we're probably going to keep an eye on in the next few months as more data become available on more recent human history.
Just because of the topic of this conversation today, I mean, I've heard the property insurance challenges being referred to as kind of a modern version of redlining. And, so I think it's something that really deserves a lot of attention. I mean, I think in Florida and California, I think it's because of the huge and recurring, weather events that are doing it. But here in Minnesota, I think, that is not the driver. And so it's something that we're paying really close attention to. And certainly we're hearing a lot, especially from the multifamily operators.
Yeah, we've heard similar contents, and for, similar comments, and the context was generally around safety was like the expressed reason, but basically buildings in certain neighborhoods being required to undergo security audits and being told that's the reason why the rates are going up. So I don't know if that's similar to what you heard, but that was when we heard someone make similar comments, that was how they were expressing it.
And it's a national trend. When I get together with the MEs of the rest of the country, I mean, we're all hearing it. And the National Multifamily Association is paying a lot of attention to this right now as well. And so, I do think there are folks that are beginning to track it from a data perspective. I think it's rising to the level of more than anecdote, and it's more than, it's not isolated. It really feels to be like a national problem.
I will ask our final question of the panel. In many communities, we have rising rent and low vacancy. How do we start to balance choice with affordability and neighborhood options? And how do we create opportunities for people to really choose where they want to live and have an opportunity to thrive?
At a high level, this is what we've been discussing throughout our entire conversation. And I feel like my colleagues did an amazing job talking about both what is the nuanced realities of what all actors need to consider when we're coming together to build and support community and the challenges in doing that. And then the communities that I think that are most often left behind with how our system is currently running. We've kind of talked about that in many ways throughout. And I also feel like maybe what's helpful in the close is each one of us sharing whether something we have seen that's being done that's moving the dial in some way, and or advice for how individuals can be a part of that change. I often feel like the question feels daunting when we're talking about changing the entire system, but there are small things that we all can do. I guess my answer to the small thing that I think we all can do, I do think there are individual things that we all can lean into. I can think about both my work in advocacy and intention to expand dialogues as very intentional, because I hope that work creates a ripple and supports influencers and other community members who are either receiving developments to rethink how they think about community and or influences or in positions to create policy, to think differently about who they're leaving out and what they're proposing. And I'd argue that's the work that I'm trying to do. What comes up for other folks as we close?
Last year we had the largest investment in housing the state's ever made, and it's not enough. And I just feel like people underestimate the power of 2 phone calls, one to their state representative and one to their state senator. But they expect me to come into their office and advocate for more housing, but they need to hear from their constituents. And so I think that's really important. We need to invest. Yeah, we're doing a good job. I think that where we're investing, we're really trying to target getting rents as low as we can, and looking at the percentage of units that are at 50% AMI and below. But we just need to invest, and can't take our eye off the ball on that. And next year is going to be another budget year, but we're probably not going to have a $17 billion surplus again. So it just needs to remain a top tier issue. We tend to get one-time funding. We need to grow the base of funding so that developers know that we've got year-over-year opportunities to do what needs to be done. And I just say, don't underestimate the power of a constituent call.
I'll agree with the commissioner there. This talk has been around the Fair Housing Act, and that's a federal law that's enacted on a federal level and but protects folks on a state and local level. But states and cities can enact further protections around discrimination in housing. And the reality is, I think folks here know that all politics is local, and there are very clear examples of local ordinances and cities putting in place, powerful protections that have then gone on and to have led to successful state policies in this arena. So especially if you have an experience, a lived experience that you can share, you feel comfortable sharing, go out there and make your voice heard.
And I think cities and states are similarly looking at ways to make it easier to build and support and invest in housing opportunities. So as states and cities are implementing those things around the nation, we'll be keeping an eye out for opportunities to talk about what's working well and maybe what barriers people are encountering as they try to roll out solutions to supply constraints. And then would just echo what's already been said about the importance of participation. It's something we hear time and again from people who work in this field, that showing up in your local decision makers forums can really help things.
So I agree with what everyone has said, and in terms of funding, ACER, we're part of a group that is working on a constitutional amendment to come up with a permanent source of funding for housing, and I think that is I think a critical thing that we need to do is to create a permanent more sustainable source of funding, so that a lot of times even what is put in the bucket is just a drop in the bucket. It doesn't get to addressing the issue. And so if we're really serious about addressing the housing issues, we really need to get to the starting point to say, what does the problem look like, and what is the amount of money that we really need to resolve it.
We have come to the end of our event. So thank you to all our panelists for joining us today and for bringing their perspectives to this important conversation. More information about the What's Next Roundtable series and recordings of this event and past events can be found on the College of Liberal Arts website at cla.umn.edu. I hope you will join us again in the future. Until then, stay well and have a great afternoon.